It's April 9th, 1609, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
Less is more, so the saying goes, and certainly that is what King Philip III of Spain thought when he issued a decree for the expulsion of the Moors, known by then as the Moriscos, who were forced to leave Spain today in history in 1609.
Yeah, and this had been a long time coming. This is over a century after the fall of Granada, the last Moorish kingdom of the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. The Christian reconquest had been a success. You know, Spain was no longer a country of which you could say there were Muslim enclaves. There were people who had descended from the Moors who were still in those places. And for that 100 years ever since, for a lot of it, people, normal people, civilians, not in political life, not at war, had got on perfectly well with each other, whether they had a Moorish background or whether they had a Christian background. But politically, the Moors were always there as a potential scapegoat. And Philip III at this point, he's just had a truce with the heretics in the Netherlands. He needs a big gesture that's going to be popular at home, that's going to distract public attention, and also, crucially, can repurpose the navy from fighting to transporting people. So he thinks, presto, let's expel the Moriscos. That's going to be popular with everyone who's got a sneaking suspicion there's a fifth column of Muslims in our country. And I have a purpose for all these boats.
Yeah, after the Christian reconquest of Spain, there was this sizable population descended from Arabs and Berber people who had come over with the conquerors. And I mean, it is mad to think that this history of Spain is just so different from so many other countries in Western Europe. Between the 700s and the 11th, 12th century, almost the whole of modern-day Spain and Portugal was a series of Islamic emirates. You know, the Muslim rulers were a minority, and they allowed the Spanish to broadly carry on with their Christian religion, but they heavily influenced the culture, especially as you were saying in Andalusia, Granada, Cordoba, all those places that people go and visit now to admire the Moorish architecture. And the sort of the kind of dirty secret for the Inquisition and for the Spanish crown, who are very deeply entwined in the 1500s and 1600s, was that huge amounts of Spaniards had converted to Islam during those hundreds of years. The reconquest of Spain had been this huge medieval cause célèbre for Christian Europe. We're liberating the Spanish from these Muslim rulers, but actually a lot of that reconquest came with reconversions. There were whole areas that had either adopted Islam and Arabic practices or who had retained their Christian faith but still lived in kind of a very Arabic influenced style, especially in the south. They spoke an Arabic dialect. And so in the 1500s and the early 1600s, there was like a very real fear that could happen again. It wasn't just, we don't want to have people who we suspect may secretly still be Muslims in the country. It was still within cultural memory that there was a time when lots of Spanish people too were Muslims, and that could happen again, especially with the Ottoman Empire starting to build up strongholds along the coast of North Africa, like frighteningly close to the southern coast of Spain.
And that's probably why the expulsion process of the Moriscos was so harsh and, as it turned out, quite chaotic. Certain exceptions were granted. 6 families out of every 100 would be allowed to stay behind to maintain the infrastructure of the towns that had been predominantly Morisco inhabited. But very few took advantage of this kind offer because they basically thought, well, they're going to allow us to stay and then they're still going to exile us later. Many of the Moriscos were also forced to pay for their own transport into exile. Typically, they were sent over to North Africa, and there they were often not met with open arms but outright hostility. And so, because news of this gradually got out as the process went on, unrest began to erupt aboard the ships, and some Moriscos began resisting and being killed in clashes with the crews, and news then spread fear among those still back in Valencia and around Spain more broadly, and that contributed to these really wide uprisings that were only eventually put down by November. So there was this long period where the Moriscos were fighting back.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we have a sort of sardonic and jolly tone, and this happened 500 years ago, but I mean, it's worth calling what it is. This was an attempt at ethnic cleansing. Yes. They were saying, oh, we'll expatriate these people, but A, they had nowhere to be expatriated to because they weren't from anywhere. I mean, yeah, centuries before they were from Africa, but they didn't know anyone in Africa. They were Spanish. And B, they didn't really care what happened to them once they got on the ships. And, we don't know how many people we're talking about, actually. You see wildly different estimates between 300,000 and 900,000 people that were deported. It was probably the lower end of that. But even if it was 300,000, again, taking a sort of mean estimate, probably about 2/3 of those people died en route. So that's 200,000 people were killed, basically for no other reason than the king had decided he didn't want Muslims around.
And the question of what faith they actually followed is really interesting, because on paper they were almost all Christian, partly because there had been so many crackdowns to ensure that no one practicing the Muslim faith could remain, openly in Spain. But the nature of the way that they had converted really gives rise to suspicion that they were continuing to worship as Muslims in secret. Because, for instance, in Granada, when it was reconquered, like the last emirate to fall, basically the inhabitants, they were Muslim majority at that point, were given the choice: convert now en masse, everyone gets baptized today or you'll be executed. You can see that those conversions are not necessarily going to be the most authentic changes of heart.
Not the best circumstances to open your heart to Jesus, is it?
No, indeed. And Spain was, up until the late 1500s, Spain was just a series of independent kingdoms, and the situation was really different in all of them too. So you had places like the Kingdom of Valencia, where Moriscos were this huge peasant underclass, like really propping up the agricultural industry, and they were very segregated from what were called the old Christians, sort of indigenous Spanish Catholics. And so they were probably at least following Islamic, Arabic traditions, even if some of them were authentically Christian by that point. Then you had places like Granada, which was heavily Arabized. It was very much, people speaking Arabic dialect, very frightening to the Catholic Church. And then you had places, like Castile, where the Morisco population was smaller and it was highly assimilated. You wouldn't have been able to tell them from their old Christian neighbours. So it was a very different picture in different parts of Spain. And that's reflected in how the expulsion was carried out too. In Valencia, it was quite harsh. Valencia was the first area of Spain to carry out these expulsions, and Moriscos were ordered to leave all of their assets and await deportation to their assigned embarkation point with only as much as they could carry. Their land and their assets were all confiscated by the crown. But where in Castile, for instance, where people were better integrated, there's suspicion that lots of Moriscos were able to remain. They were able to pass under the radar, either because they were indistinguishable from their neighbours or because they were so thoroughly integrated that their neighbours and local authorities would step in to try and protect them and keep them in the community.
I mean, that's kind of the problem with having a king that's, responsible for the whole country, isn't it? Like, you've got massive different regional variations there amongst the integration. There were Moriscos who were in contact with the Corsairs in North Africa who were raiding Spanish towns. They were a threat. I mean, it wasn't completely dreamt up as propaganda. But on the other hand, you had some Moriscos dotted around the country who had been there for centuries and who actually were sort of happy enough doing the fudge of saying, I'm a Christian in public, and then sort of secretly getting their kids circumcised and eating couscous. I mean, that's what it extended to. It's kind of cultural Islamic tradition that carried on. And so you had that massive spectrum all being persecuted on this day.
And it also meant that different regions fared differently after the expulsion because, for example, in Valencia, there was this massive disruption. A third of its population had just been removed. Whole farmland was being abandoned. Infrastructure declined and there were huge labour shortages that hit. And so the Kingdom of Valencia was in a lot of trouble. You've created a whole issue like Brexit created when suddenly this whole group of migrant workers were taken away from the workforce. And what are you going to replace them with? Well, they didn't really have a simple solution, especially because the edict had been so harsh, so sudden and so final.
And that seems like a crass comparison, but that sort of is one in the sense that, like, people said, didn't they, about sort of migrants that came from Eastern Europe to the UK, that they worked well because they were away from their families and they were only in the UK to make money. I mean, the Moors had this reputation amongst the farm owners of whoever owns a Moor owns gold. And basically that work ethic was because of their sobriety, which was because of their Muslimness. So there is actually a connection where they didn't want to lose the Moriscos because they were hard workers, because they weren't drinking.
I mean, as well as the trauma of the entire people who were expelled and abused and, often slaughtered, I think there's another tragedy looking at it from a sort of contemporary vantage, which is all of that loss of culture and collaboration that you can see when you go to places like Granada and visit the Alhambra, or you go to Cordoba and go to the Mezquita, and these, like, the coming together of these worlds, actually in some places not just of Muslim and Christian, but also Jewish, and there was obviously a Jewish expulsion that came before this. But, you know, the loss of that time when those cultures were living so harmoniously, at least in their creative output, I'm sure there were tensions as well, but it does seem like this intense tragedy on the level of, you know, thinking about what could have been achieved in terms of ongoing harmony and construction and output, that this came to such a crashing end on this day.
Or just understanding. Interestingly, the use of the veil by women was one of the things that there was a public proclamation against in this sort of slow build-up to this expulsion. But curiously, it was because Spanish Christians thought the veil allowed Muslim women to be promiscuous. So it's just really interesting to think of from a 20th, 21st century standpoint, where the debate amongst non-Muslims is that, you know, Muslims wearing the veil is ultra-conservative and controlling and against sexual liberation of women, that it was seen in completely the opposite way 500 years earlier. And you think if there'd been that 500 years of dialogue in between, we'd all be eating couscous.
Yay.
Tomorrow.
Ladies, in particular, should not be seen alone with a banana.
Don't eat banana without a chaperone.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/Retrospectors.